Hello everybody, welcome to Drydock episode 61. Not a lot of channel admin to go on today, other than to say that there is a little bit of a book giveaway today, so if you would like to expand your naval knowledge by means of reading a couple more history books, there are a number available. There's The Forgotten War of the Royal Navy, the Baltic Sea 1918 to 1920, also Freeing the Baltic 1918 to 1920. These were two of the books that I got for reference during the research for the Baltic War video that went up on Friday. And there's also the Osprey Battle of Tsushima reference book. It's quite a nice little book, and that formed one of the secondary sources that was used for the Battle of Tsushima video. So there's 3 books to give away, and therefore, in the not-so-pinned post, stick your name down, not asking for anything complicated this time. And I'll pick 3 random winners in next week's Drydock to receive those books. And of course, to announce the winner of the 75k subscriber giveaway, that's the nice big book on the Bismarck. That winner is, according to the random number generator, Tree Shaker Tucker, who apparently has been watching this channel since the very first video. So, congratulations to him or her. If you wish to email me at 5minuteguides@gmail.com to arrange for me to get this book to you. And while we're on the subject of books, one of the subscribers reached out and asked if I wouldn't mind giving one of his books a plug. This is a little bit off the kilter for naval history, but never mind. He asked. I had a look. Don't see any reason why not. Doesn't hurt anyone. So Tyler Weaver is the writer of a book called The Maiden's War, The Griffin and Dragon Book 1, available on Kindle hardback and paperback. Link in the description somewhere. Which is basically kind of like an old fantasy World War I novel, I guess. I had a quick look through it. Seems perfectly serviceable. Reviews are good. I'm actually quite enjoying it in my off time. So yeah, shout out to that book as he asked for. I'll say link in the description if you want to check it out. And to forestall all the obvious questions, no, I'm not getting anything out of that, other than the satisfaction of helping someone else out. So yeah, if any of the rest of you happen to be publishers of various books that you'd like a shout out for, feel free to chuck an email to 5minuteguides@gmail.com. I will, of course, have a quick read first. And so on to the questions. The questions for this week are taken from the Almirante Grau class cruiser video, Guide 134, and a whole medley of uploaded revoiced videos. But just before we do that, a quick note and follow up to a previous question. You may recall in, I think, the last but one dry dock, there was a question about ships flooding their torpedo blisters to be able to tilt in order to fire. Now, that was a question that I answered at the time of recording, but I was also discussing this question with a Discord member of the Discord channel, unsurprisingly enough, and he was very much kind enough to dig up the actual report from USS Texas for when it did precisely this during the bombardment at D-Day. However, in the rush to record the last dry dock episode, I made the rather cardinal mistake of forgetting to actually mention that, so I apologise. And here is the deck report from USS Texas from the day, found by Admiral Davidoff. So many thanks to him, and once again, apologies for missing out the appropriate reference in the previous dry dock episode. And so we lead off our first question from Stuart Ellinson. Did the World War II Regia Marina ever acquire any radar-equipped vessels? The lack of this seems to have been a major factor in the loss of Zara, Pola and Fiume, and I'd have thought the Italians would have wanted to acquire such technology ASAP in 1941. Well, the answer there is that, well, yes, the Italians did have radar. In fact, they had some prototypes designed in the mid to late 1930s. However, for various reasons, the budget for it was cut and development ground to a screaming halt. After the Battle of Cape Matapan and the Royal Navy blowing apart 3 of the Italians' nicest heavy cruisers at point-blank range thanks to radar at night, they somewhat understandably developed a rather renewed interest in their radar sets, and development was back on. To their credit, pretty quickly they dug out the old prototypes and spun them up to speed and installed them on various ships for testing. Their particular radar type was called GUFO, GUFO, as modelled here quite lovely by Scipione Africano, which was one of the light cruisers that was equipped with such radar. And yeah, they started to farm those out. Unfortunately, again, due to a combination of technological and budget limitations, they didn't get that many of them into service, only about a dozen or so before Italy crashed out of the war, at least as far as the Axis was concerned. But they did try. One can only speculate what the Mediterranean theatre would have been like had the budget not been cut in the mid to late 1930s, and the Italians had actually entered the war with GUFO, which, okay, fair enough, it wasn't the world's biggest and best radar set, but it was certainly a pretty serviceable and solid piece of kit. And I don't necessarily know if it would have saved the Italian heavy cruisers, but it certainly would have given them more advanced warning, and they could have made a bit more of a fight of it. ST Rub asks, did the destroyer leader concept ever work for anyone? The answer is it varied considerably. The general idea of having a slightly larger destroyer based on the rest of the ships that it was leading in its flotilla didn't work out as spectacularly well as they thought. I mean, obviously, the extra space allowing for the flotilla's command staff was useful, but in terms of having dramatically increased combat effectiveness, not so much. I mean, one extra gun on a destroyer, yeah, it's useful, but it's not the world's most groundbreaking upgrade in armament. Where the effectiveness of destroyer and flotilla leaders did show a little bit more tended to be around the World War One period, where you had a number of flotilla leader concepts that were less slightly large destroyers and more dedicated small cruisers, particularly things like the Arethusa-class. Those did tend to work relatively well because their speed and maneuverability allowed them to keep up with the destroyers, and their size meant that they weren't that much bigger a target, but they carried considerably heavier armament than the destroyers that they were leading, and that actually did give the flotillas a significant firepower boost in the face of the enemy. It also helped, to be perfectly fair, that the British flotillas that tended to be led by these cruisers running into German flotillas, a lot of the German torpedo boat and destroyer flotillas tended to on a little bit towards the small side, which meant that the gap in offensive capability between a small cruiser and a relatively small torpedo boat was even more considerable than it would have been in perhaps other matchup scenarios. So yeah, it was kind of it could work, but it tended to work really well. It tended to require a considerably larger vessel than just a slightly extended destroyer. So something like an Omaha or an Atlanta, for example, would actually be another good example of a ship that, in theory, would work a lot better as a destroyer flotilla leader as compared to just a slightly extended destroyer. Andrea Marioni asks, during the Battle of the Denmark Strait, after Hood had been sunk, another 15-inch shell from Bismarck struck Prince of Wales, penetrated her hull below the bell arm and came to rest in the magazines, but did not explode. It was only discovered once the ship was undergoing repairs. Had that shell exploded, would Prince of Wales have suffered the same fate as Hood, or would she have survived the shell's explosion? So as you can see in the picture above, courtesy of the HMS Hood Association, the shell hit didn't actually end up near the magazines. It shell hit 5. The orange hit just right near down the bottom of the ship, below the second funnel. Now that might give you a clue. The shell wasn't actually near the 14-inch magazines. It was in fact near the boiler rooms. Now, if it had exploded, there's two ways of looking at this. If the shell's fuse had actually been working, then the shell wouldn't actually have wouldn't actually have exploded inside Prince of Wales, because for the shell to reach that deep into the ship in terms of actual depth and then obviously penetrate, It had to have hit the water a fair bit of the way back, and the impact with the water should have initiated the fuse, at which point, with the delay on German fuses, the shell would have exploded short of the ship. Obviously, that didn't happen. The shell was a dud, and hence it ended up inside. If we're going to hypothesize that for whatever reason the fuse completely failed to initiate when it hit the water, but came back to life at some point and just decided to explode for whatever reason, Prince of Wales probably could have survived the hit. It certainly would have lost a fair bit of power and possibly been dead in the water, or at least very severely slowed down. So it would have been a fairly crippling hit, but in and of itself, the shell hit probably wouldn't have been enough to fatally damage Prince of Wales. Jim MacDonald asks, why did HMS Lion use a turret layout with a centre Q turret instead of a rear super-firing X turret like the Queen Elizabeth class? This is something that actually the Lion class came in for criticism for at the time that they were designed, with many people pointing out that actually it probably would have been better to have 2 forward and 2 aft twin turrets instead of the layout they actually were given. The two primary reasons that they went with this Q turret layout were, one, cost and weight savings, in as much as having the sort of slightly taller X turret with its super-firing barbette meant an increase in displacement, because obviously the barbette's quite heavily armoured, and if it's taller that means there's more of it, which means it's going to cost more. Plus it was also slightly easier, apparently, to just drop in a whole new block of engineering plant in the position where X turret was on the Orion class when they were modifying the design to make the Lions, than it was to delete Q turret and relieve X turret. And of course, with increased displacement comes increased financial cost, and the Royal Navy was being a bit careful in the estimates when Lion was being built. The other reason was blast. So Lion was built at a point where there was still a certain degree of open sighting hoods and such on British turrets, and that basically meant that you couldn't fire the guns dead level, kind of as they're shown here, with a super firing turret firing directly over a lower turret. If the guns were elevated any considerable amount, you could, but in closer range actions, if you fired like that, you'd actually end up sending blast into the lower turret, which is not a good thing for the lower turret crew. And so it was also felt that by having Q turret separate, this would allow point blank engagements at with more guns in service, rather than potentially knocking out your own turret. The fact that this was only really a concern when your guns were in either completely fore or completely aft positions, which Q turret physically was incapable of doing, because hey, there was a massive funnel in the way, seems to have slipped the minds of a few people. So I'm not necessarily sure how much that holds up. I think it's more to do with saving displacement and cost. Luke Williams asks a very specific and very detailed question. He asks, what's your analysis on the existence of anti-aircraft guns on Yamato's B and C main gun turrets, or B and Y, I guess they would be, in following British nomenclature. He says, I've seen many model kits and diagrams with these guns in place, but just as many with these guns non-existent, and I've not found any period photos of her with these guns, aside from one photo of her being bombed by US aircraft that has a single circular looking mount on B turret. Did these guns exist? Were they intended to be put on but never in place? The reason is I have a model Yamato that comes with these guns, and I'm wondering if for historical accuracy I should leave them off or not. Basically, the answer comes down to what period of the Yamato's lifetime are you actually modelling the ship on? Because you can see in this photo, taken from her fitting out, when she was still equipped with the 666-inch turrets on the wings, that, at least on the aft turret here, she does not, in fact, have those anti-aircraft guns. Now, the thing is, the battleship was refitted quite often during the World War II with ever-increasing numbers of anti-aircraft guns. So I think the photo that you're referencing in particular is one taken in 1944 when it was hit by a bomb in the forecastle, which I will show you now. And whilst sea turret is somewhat obscured by smoke, you can just about tell there isn't really anything on C or X, depending, as I say, on how you have the designations. And on B turret, there is a small circular object on this photo. It's kind of on the top left of the turret roof, but it's really a bit out of place and a bit too small to likely be any kind of anti-aircraft installation. It's more than likely a lifeboat or something that someone's left up there. Although it could be a very small, maybe a single 25mm. This is the wonderful thing, is that somewhat like Age of Sail ships that ended up going out with rated numbers of guns but actually carried slightly different and increased armaments, by the time of the late war, various ships were officially carrying X number of anti-aircraft guns, but quite often someone would ship an extra one or two here or there. So at this point in 1944, the ship is definitely not carrying anti-aircraft guns really on its main turrets. However, by 1945, when this photo was taken, and if you want to look up the original, it's Yamato under air attack on the 19th of March 1945. Now, obviously this is only ever going to be in 1080p, so I say look up the original if you really want, but when you zoom in on this particular photo, you can in fact see there are a pair of anti-aircraft gun pits on B turret, and there are also a pair of anti-aircraft gun pits on the aft turret. The situation isn't really helped by the fact there's actually very few period time photos of the ship, but this particular photo is pretty decisive about those gun turrets being in place. So I'd say yes, the ship did have anti-aircraft guns mounted on its B turret and its rear turret. However, this was only for a very short period towards the end of the war. So if you're modelling the ship, make sure that if you're going to include them, that you are modelling the ship with its 1945 anti-aircraft setup. Because if you're not, then don't put those guns on. Arne Meyer asks quite the complicated question, but let's go for it. He says, why did the Union of South Africa not get or build a cruiser like the other three dominions? Arguably being amongst the most important since it controlled the Cape, a vital and pivotal trade route, with Marshal Smuts being the deputy on the War Cabinet and supplying a lot of coal and steel, as well as other war materials to the Empire, part paying for lend-lease, etc., plus obviously its contributions in the realm of air forces and land forces. Apparently, Japanese and German submarines were often detected off South Africa and fire exchanged. Graf Spee passed by on its way to target the Indian Ocean. Also, is it true that a South African Air Force plane or pilot sank an Axis battleship? Also, can we please get the Cullinan diamonds in the British Crown back, please? Well, as regards the Cullinan diamond, it's actually one of the few parts of the British Crown jewels for which there isn't that much legal wrangling. Of all people, if you can believe it, Louis Botha, Boer War hero on the Boer side of things, actually put a vote to the Transvaal colony government to buy the thing from the mining company that had found it and present it to, at the time, King Edward VII as a token of loyalty. So yeah, if someone who spent a good portion of his adult life fighting the British decided he was going to vote his government to buy the thing and give it as a gift, well, I think that thing's staying here for a good long time. I mean, flipping heck, we're not giving up the Koh-i-Noor anytime soon either, so I think the Queen likes her shiny rocks. As far as a South African pilot sinking a German battleship goes, I don't know, is the answer. The two candidates which I could maybe point to would be Lutzow and Admiral Scheer, as I don't know the identity of the pilots that dropped the bombs that destroyed those ships. We know the first tall boy to hit Tirpitz was dropped by an English pilot, and Gneisenau wasn't sunk; it was irreparably damaged, but again, could be a pilot there. So, without looking further into exactly who dropped which bombs and was credited with which hits, I wouldn't be able to say, but it's possible. As far as why the South African Naval Service at the time didn't have any cruisers or other major capital ships, it just seems to have been government priorities, really. the South Africans did contribute quite significantly to um, the air forces in especially in World War II, and land forces in both World Wars. But it just seems, for whatever reason, the government in South Africa wasn't too concerned about establishing its own naval force, and with the Cape, as you say, relatively vital, albeit with the Suez Canal still in operation. I guess maybe they knew the Royal Navy would have to guard such a strategic location. It's certainly something they could have afforded, but I suppose compared to somewhere like Canada or Australia, it just wasn't as high up their priority list. So that's why they didn't have a cruiser or any other thing. They certainly could have paid for it, and there's at least one alternate history out there which proposes an imperial federation forming out of the British Empire in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where South Africa has a full-on little battle fleet of its own as part of the imperial fleet. But yeah, it just seems spending priorities in the South African government, really. Kestrel Owens asks, did any navy ever consider an alternate lighter powder load for their guns so the guns could, in fact, have plunging fire on other ships when otherwise, if using full charges, they would be in the immune zone of the ship, i.e., on the belt? Not as far as I'm aware of, and it's for two particular reasons. One of which is that if you're using a lighter charge and you're going to try and drop a shell on an enemy target, that means you're going to be aiming your guns much higher. If you're aiming your guns much higher, then the shell has much further to travel, and if it has much further to travel, that means it's going to be going there. It's going to be in flight for a lot longer, especially if it's traveling slower in the first place because you've used a lighter weight charge. That in turn basically means that the calculations for hitting get a lot more complicated, and the opportunity for the enemy to evade goes up considerably. At longer ranges, even using full power charges, theoretically steering by the flash of the guns, a ship could evade incoming fire indefinitely, assuming that the guns were actually going to hit it if it stayed on target, because the flight time's so long. So there's that problem, plus also the fact if you're firing them at a lower velocity, they're going to arrive at a lower velocity, albeit plunging, so you might not actually get the deck penetration that you want anyway with your sort of impromptu mortar. The other problem is what I call the gun shadow. So that is if you fire your guns at full velocity, relatively shallow angle coming in, then whether or not they hit the target or you have this issue of the gun shadow, which is that if your shells, if the enemy target wasn't there, were going to land where the target actually is, then of course they're going to hit. But if they're coming in at a fairly shallow angle, it also means that if you've actually miscalculated and the shells are going long, there's actually a fair bit of that range where the shells are still going to hit the enemy ship, because the flight profile of the shell is shallow enough that whilst they might be flying towards a point on the ocean that is, say, several hundred yards behind the enemy ship, the superstructure or upper hull of the target gets in the way, and therefore the ship is still hit. Now, the higher and higher the angle the shell's coming in, the less and less that particular sort of shadow effect actually is. So if you're bringing the shells in steep enough to actually impact the deck, you've basically got to hit that 100 feet or so bracket where the enemy ship is, assuming it's broadside onto you. And those two factors all combined together actually make hitting very difficult. And as I say, with low velocity, you might not even have the deck penetration you need. So unfortunately, no, people didn't tend to go with that. They would just content themselves with blasting away with the normal full power charges. Because the other thing you've got to remember is that whilst the immune zone is there based on the ship's main armour belt thickness and potentially also barbette and gun turret armour thickness, there's an awful lot of other stuff there that isn't as well protected, and even in a ship's immune zone you can quite happily blast away at and cause significant amounts of damage and problems by hitting, such as secondary battery, AA battery, bridge, fire control systems, etc., etc., and also just hits to the boundstone that cause flooding will cause the ship to become less stable, slow down, and so forth. So you generally try and keep firing away with the full power charges to decomplicate your ability to hit. Versus Arch asks, your assessment of King George V as the battleship better protected than Iowa differs from the assessment at combinedfleet.com. How do you comment on the differences with emphasis on missed out or misinterpreted data? Okay, well, I suppose I did say before I don't really rate that particular site's comparisons very highly, so I guess I should probably go into detail a little bit more since you asked. Now, with respect to that particular comparison that you've isolated between King George V and Iowa, if you happen to look at their page, the issues I take are as follows. One is that at the time that the site was written, that article was written, the author assumed that the special treatment steel layer outside of Iowa's main belt served as a decapping layer, which artificially inflated the effectiveness of Iowa's belt considerably. He based that on an article by Nathan Oken. Nathan Oken subsequently published an article, basically put his hands up and said, actually, sorry, that was wrong. It wouldn't work that way. So just going on that value at all, the analysis of Iowa's belt protection effectiveness is deeply flawed, albeit that, fair enough, at the time that the article was written on Combined Fleet, they may not have known that. Then when you go and have a look at the deck armour, when you drill all the way back down through various links to the finer details of what he is actually using there, I hesitate to say deliberate bias, but when you look at the deck armour stack that is shot at for the South Dakota-Iowa comparison, they include every single potential piece of deck armour on the ship, both the actual main thickness deck and the slightly thinner decks above and below. Whereas when they analyse the King George V's deck, despite the fact that King George V likewise has thinner, sort of just over 1 inch, between 1.25 and 1.5 inch armour decks separate to its 6-inch main deck, those aren't included, which rather artificially skews the total deck penetration, in my opinion. There's also a small possibility that they might have taken the main armour deck on the Iowa as a single homogeneous one, when in fact it was a paired, sort of basically a laminate between STS steel and Class B armour. But that much, it's not entirely clear to me from the data that they provide whether or not that was done, so I'm not going to go on record as saying that's another definitive mistake, because it's entirely possible they did take that into account. But I do stand by my point that they seem to be happily including basically every single piece of armoured deck available throughout the depth of the Iowa class, but for whatever reason ignoring those other provisions on the King George V, which again skews things completely. Finally, in sort of the another part of Combined Fleet where they go into it in a bit more detail, as well as referencing back to more detailed stuff on NavWeps, they also ding the King George V's along with the Littorios for having inadequately armoured control positions topsides, i.e. not having conning towers, which in an analysis of the ship's protective scheme, i.e. what's there to protect the ship as opposed to the officers, that seems rather arbitrary and unfair, especially since, I mean, you can make an argument as to whether or not conning tower was worth it. I personally tend to agree with the British concept that given how many people went into conning towers then got horribly murdered by incoming shell fire, I tend to agree that the conning tower probably wasn't worth it in the grand scheme of things. But there's no justification given in the article. It's just arbitrarily we're digging them a point for this because reasons. If there was a discussion or some kind of thing where it said, well, actually, I think that having an armour conning tower is a better idea, then I'd still disagree with it, but fair enough. But the fact it's just, no, arbitrarily, they don't have armored conning towers, so I'm going to take points off them. That doesn't sit particularly well with me. So yeah, it's a combination of somewhat arbitrary decisions, questionable figures used for calculation of different ships' actual deck armor vulnerabilities, and the use of an obsolete idea when it comes to what exactly that SDS outer layer on Iowa's belt actually does. As a result, pretty much the entire analysis is flawed in my opinion, and therefore using the slightly more comprehensive analysis, I think King George V then comes out superior at effective battle ranges, albeit, as I've said before, the Iowa's angled armour scheme does allow it for superior protection at extreme long range, but not at the more general effective battle ranges. There is also the minor detail of exactly how much, and I've said this before in other articles, or videos, exactly how much better you attribute British face-hardened armour as being compared to other people's armour. As I mentioned before, different books will give you different figures. Anything from 4 to 5% up to 25%, with most of the figures kind of hitting somewhere in the 8 to 12 or 8 to 15% region. But it's not clear from this which particular figure they use. I'm guessing they probably used the Nathan Oken's face hard calculations for it, but I can't prove it one way or the other. So yeah, there's a bit of a sliding scale there, but ignoring that, please see my other criticisms. Andrea Marioni asks, aside from Blucher in the German Navy, are there any other cursed names on warships in other navies? Well, it depends how you look at it, I guess. Depending on whether or not you want to argue in terms of ships where they build things and bad things keep happening to ships of that name, or ships where something's gone so horribly and catastrophically wrong they basically retire the name or are very unlikely to ever use it again. From a mix of those factors, and a few others, you could say the name USS Montana is somewhat cursed. Not because anything particularly terrible happened to ships named Montana, but more because Montana as a state name should have received a battleship, but they kept getting the battleship that was designated as Montana cancelled, to the point that it remains the only US state that didn't get a battleship named after it, as far as I can tell. They basically went from pre-dreadnought era all the way through to nuclear ballistic missile sub, and there were 2, possibly 3, depending on exactly how far down the line you want to take it as official, but at least 2, possibly 3 USS Montanas, all of whom ended up getting cancelled in terms of sort of dreadnought era battleships. You've also got, for somewhat obvious reasons, the Kamchatka, which does not appear to be a very popular name in the Russian Navy going forward after the Battle of Tsushima. I rather doubt the Royal Navy is going to bring back HMS Hood anytime soon. Albeit that HMS Hood was a very popular name for lots of different ships. I think the rather cataclysmic end of the last one is probably going to keep that particular name out of the Royal Navy's books for quite a while. James Sumpter asks, had they been built, how would the G3 and N3 designs have lent themselves to mid-war upgrades after navies found out that the answer to how many AA guns you want was yes? So had the G3 and N3 classes been built and then subsequently found themselves in World War II and in need of an anti-aircraft refit, they're actually in a surprisingly good position to do so, for 2 reasons. Well, one, they're very big, especially the G3s, so there's a lot of real estate to start sticking AA guns. Secondly, as you can see from these diagrams, they're designed with this 2 turret forward, 1 amidships, immediately behind the superstructure arrangement. This actually means there's an awful lot of deck space, pretty much the entire rear half of the ship, especially in the G3's case, where you can have uninterrupted ridiculous numbers of anti-aircraft guns. So obviously on the ships as designed, they had split secondary batteries next to the superstructure and aft. But if you were going to go sort of full American on this, um, or possibly sort of HMS renowned refit style, you could have a nice cluster of dual purpose, maybe 4.5-inch AA next to the superstructure, and that'd be kind of your heavy AA. You could stick a few 40mm or 20mm mounts on the on B turret and on, what would you call it? Not Q turret, I guess. But then once you get past that and you get to the aft section, that sort of triangular section of upper deck around the funnels lends itself very well to mass clusters of 20mm and 40mm guns. Obviously, you can stick maybe one or two on the bridge tower as well if you like. And then you've got the sides of the ship aft, which as they extend for a fairly long section. And as you can see, the secondary batteries already go back a fair distance, so that's an opportunity for even more dual-purpose guns and lots and lots and lots of 40 and 20mm. Now, historically, on the more heavily refitted ships for anti-aircraft, there were gun clusters in these areas in the aft of the ship, but they were limited to a degree by the swing of the rear turret or turrets and the blast radius of those guns when they fired. Not so much the blast radius on the crews, because the crews wouldn't be operating at the same time the main guns were firing, but more the blast radius of what would actually potentially heavily damage the guns themselves. In this case, that's not so much an issue, so you can fill up a lot more deck space with it. And way, way back in a dry dock a long time ago, I actually did this mashup. I took a G3 ship model off of Ship Bucket, and I kind of did a sort of modernization for it, where, as you can see, my main gift to the G3 class was an awful lot of twin 5.25-inch turrets with a bunch of bofas and pom-poms stuck on there. Actually, probably nowhere near enough, come to think of it. It was a very quick and crude mashup. But that gives you some idea of the flavour of what could be accomplished, especially with a G3 battlecruiser. A lot of AA. The N3 is obviously being slightly shorter, wouldn't have had as much, but yeah, the G3s could have become absolutely ferocious anti-aircraft ships if given the chance. Type here asks, can more than one Mogami power plant fit in an Admiral class? If so, how many extra knots would be gained if this was done? So I think this question's arisen from my pointing out that Mogami's power plant was just as, if not more powerful than Hood's. And yeah, so Hood's machinery space is 391 feet long, as compared to Mogami's engineering space, which is about 78 meters long, which in feet amounts to 255 feet. So Hood's machinery space is about 100 and just under 140 feet longer, which means that it is about just over 50% larger. So yeah, that's a considerable amount. You've also got to bear in mind that Mogami's beam is about 60 feet. Hood's beam is about just over 30 feet more than that. So again, Hood's width is about 50% larger. So you're talking about a fair bit of space in there comparatively, because it's not just a 50% increase. You're talking about volumetrically. So even if for the minute we assume that the height is the same, the surface area available to actually pin machinery down on is going to be considerably larger. So you're talking about, roughly speaking, again, this is sort of back of the envelope calculations, but they're going to be fairly close. Roughly speaking, Hood has about 2.75 times more machinery room floor space as compared to Mogami. So, in theory, if you're using power plants as efficient as Mogami's, then, well, 2.75 times the power generation. So let's say 2.5 times, given the fact that you're not necessarily going to squeeze everything into the exact square footage. So again, linear scaling. Obviously, this is all very much ballpark, but in theory, if you're using Mogami style power plants, except multiplying them over by that increase in square footage, that theoretically gives you around about 380,000 shaft horsepower, which is a terrifying amount. Um, the details for the Ford class carriers aren't available yet, and the Nimitz classes were a little bit of a step down in shaft horsepower from the crazy amount that was on USS Enterprise. So, using USS Enterprise CVN 65 as our sort of standard, albeit bearing in mind that obviously those figures may well be underestimates given how fast Enterprise was theoretically rumoured to be able to go. But the official rated shaft horsepower of CVN 65 is 280,000. It's 100,000 shaft horsepower more than CVN 65, which was a considerably larger ship. Um, Now, how fast you could make that thing go, therefore, if somehow you discovered unobtainium propeller shafts and everything, so the ship didn't tear itself to pieces. Well, again, by very rough calculations, because there's an awful lot of complex calculation that goes into determining just how fast you'll get through the water for a given power plant. You need to know things like what kind of propellers you've got, what their efficiency rating is at different revolutions and different speeds, what the total resistance of the ship is, and I do not have the time to do all of that. But there is a rough rule of thumb, which is that speed is shaft horsepower is proportional to the cube of speed, which is why you get this exponential increase in amount of power needed as you go up the tree. So just using that, and obviously bearing in mind that this may well be completely off the mark, and if somebody is an expert in calculating these things and fancies going through all the calculations for HMS Hood, then please feel free to do so. But just using that general rule of thumb, the ratio of Hood in its original condition, i.e. 151,000 shaft horsepower and 32 knots, well, the cube of 32 is 32,768, which gives a ratio of 4.6. If you then plug in 380,000 shaft horsepower and try to achieve the same 4.6 ratio on a cube of speed, you end up with a truly worrying between 43 and 44 knots. In fact, at 43.5 knots, the ratios are almost identical. So yes, that is quite the terrifying speed. You're talking about 80 kilometers an hour, or 50 miles per hour. So yeah, imagine HMS Hood, 40 plus thousand tons of battle cruiser, moving fast enough to get a speeding ticket in on some of the lower speed limit motorways in the world. That's quite worrying, actually. Just as well they didn't go for that, I think. I have a feeling the ship probably would have torn itself apart from the stresses of that going anywhere near that fast. Although it would have been highly amusing to see such a refitted Hood, again, ostensibly with an unobtainium hull, just go charging into the Battle of the Denmark Strait. And so we're on to the Patreon questions. So Long John asks, what are your all-time favourite warships, and what do you think about the addition of submarines to World of Warships? Well, in a shock to no one, as I think similar questions have been asked before, there's Warspite for you. Yeah, Warspite. If I had to pick all-time across the ages, Warspite obviously, Sovereign of the Seas just for being a giant gold-plated death machine. That always makes me laugh a fair bit. Then Fletcher class destroyers, definitely have a soft spot for the Fletchers. HMS Agincourt, just for the sheer absurdity of it. You may be sensing a theme at this point. Then I can't remember exactly which one it was. It's either Minotaur or Monarch. It may well have been Minotaur, but there was a Royal Navy ironclad that just had ridiculous numbers of masts. It was kind of like the Lexington class battle cruisers, except instead of funnels, they went with masts, and it was just like all the masts. They are quite the fun thing. Kaiser for SMS Kaiser, that is the Austro-Hungarian ship, just for refusing to die, and for operating way beyond what should theoretically, by all sense and sanity, have been its expiry date. I'm also quite partial to the New Mexico class for some reason. I can't quite put my finger on it, but to me they just seem to look the best of the standard class battleships to my eye. As for what I think about addition of submarines to World of Warships, it should be interesting. Um, I enjoyed, even if I didn't quite get the hang of the submarine special event they did. So the fact that they're sort of confining them off to their own little section to start with is probably a good idea. Um, Obviously, they're probably going to be the least historical part of it, considering the actual true top speeds and underwater speeds of submarines historically. If this has always been one of the major problems I've always thought with trying to introduce submarines into World of Warships, is the fact that all else aside, and yes, arcade game balance, blah blah blah. At least the top speeds given to the warships in the game are theoretically what those warships were capable of, but yeah, to get anything other than maybe a tier 10 submarine to be of any use in any kind of actual combat scenario, they're going to have to give them artificially higher speeds that are completely unhistorical. So I'll wait and see, but with them in their own little sandbox, I'd be quite interested in seeing how they play. Matthew Ziesel asks, what is the purpose of having Marines stationed on board ships? Was their presence solely for defending against or taking part in boarding actions, or would they have been used for landings using a ship's boat? So, from the context of your question, I believe you're probably talking about the Age of Sail, at which point, yep, they very much were used for landings in ship's boats, something that would continue pretty much as long as contingents of several dozen to several hundred men could constitute effective landing forces. Nowadays, the Marines stationed aboard ships would not generally be used for landing in ships' boats, unless there's very exceptional circumstances, because the size and scale of war has moved on a bit. But as you can see in this artist rendition, there were plenty of instances where Marines were sort of collated from across the fleet and used as marine landed infantry. Quite often, because of their discipline and degree of career service, they were often used as a kind of elite infantry in a lot of battles, especially by the more maritime nations. For example, the Dutch Marines during the raid on the Medway is a good example, and of course, when the US Navy decided it had quite enough of the Barbary pirate states and went to blow up a few of their fortresses. Those were two notable examples of the Marines of the various navies landing and taking over places, and subsequently setting fire to them and stealing everything, as all good Marines should. Mason Asher Stewart asks, you've mentioned how before Churchill regarded the R-class battleships as expendable, but what about the Admiralty and others? How do they rate their chances against stuff like Scharnhorst, Bismarck, Fuso, etc.? So it depended on exactly which R-class, because various R-class had varying degrees of modernizations, but they were still considered battle-capable units, albeit somewhat slow ones. So, for example, the Royal Navy was quite happy to match them up against the refitted Italian battleships in the Mediterranean. They were fairly confident that they could see off a Scharnhorst. I mean, fair enough, the Fuso and Issei classes were pretty much static during the Pacific War, but they sent a bunch of them over with Somerville to harass and worry the Japanese in the Indian Ocean for a limited given degree of harass and worry. But they certainly, Somerville believed that they were quite perfectly capable of standing up to the Congos. So yeah, against a lot of their fellow World War One survivors, the Admiralty still rated them as perfectly survivable and even with a good chance of victory. And against smaller stuff like Deutschlands and Scharnhorst and stuff, they were still fairly confident that they'd win those as well. Against a Bismarck, well, they reckoned that an R-class could stand and fight one. They didn't necessarily believe it would win outside of exceptional luck, but at the end of the day, 8 15-inch 42 caliber guns are 8 15-inch 42 caliber guns. They're certainly capable of hurting the Bismarck, and they did specifically get refits to try and enhance their survivability and protection against such threats once the outcome of the Bismarck fight had been known, and that was specifically just in case they had to fight the Tirpitz. So they certainly didn't think they were useless in that regard, and I guess that would extend over to the Nagatos as well. So yeah, the Admiralty had a reasonably high opinion of the actual fighting power of the R-class. The main problem was actually getting them to get there in the first place. This is why, for example, they were given superchargers to increase the range of their guns so they could actually stand in the line of battle against more modern ships. Tree Shaker Tucker asks, what, in your opinion, is the most uneven naval battle where the underdog won? Discounting the Battle of Samar. Well, there's a whole load of them, but one of the ones that immediately springs to mind is Thomas Cochrane's fight between HMS Speedy with all 14 guns on the little brig sloop and 54 men versus, and bear in mind these are light guns because this is a brig, versus the Spanish frigate El Gamo carrying 32 guns, much heavier than Speedy's, and 319 men. So, to put it into a World War I, World War II context, this is probably the equivalent. This is probably the equivalent of taking a destroyer escort, or a Hunt class destroyer or something along those lines, up against something in the order of a Königsberg-like cruiser or an Atlanta or something along those lines. It's a hilariously one-sided matchup, but it's one that the Speedy actually won. Now, fair enough, it won mostly by just sneaking in so close and sticking so close to the Spanish ship that it couldn't actually depress its heavy guns far enough down to shoot the British ship away from it. And if at any point they drifted far enough apart for the Spanish to do so, it would have ended up very, very differently. But hey, it actually managed to win. So yeah, that's certainly one of them. It's got to be up there in terms of a badly outnumbered underdog. And of course, this kind of thing can't go without mention of Admiral Yi Sun-shin and his tiny fleet of turtle ships versus the Japanese invasion force. Glenn Ricafrente asks, during major refits, how exactly is the ship's beam made wider? Is it just anti-torpedo bulges that extend the beam? Do they have humongous pistons that physically stretch the width? It is generally and almost without exception the addition of bulges, as modelled here quite lovingly for us by USS Pennsylvania. There are one or two cases where the above water beam was extended very slightly, and that generally happened when you eliminated casemates. If they eliminated casemates in favour of deck-mounted artillery, there could be some minor rebuild to the sort of the superstructure elements of the ship, and by that I mean basically the deck or two below the main deck, not the actual superstructure as in above that period section. Because when you're ripping out the casemates and stuff, you're doing some fairly major changes to the structure of the ship, and very occasionally there'd be a little bit of an extra sort of width given to help support some of the new deck-mounted guns. It was a very rare occurrence. It was almost certainly, generally, just torpedo bulges and similar. And George Armatus asks, what did the RNAS, that's the Royal Naval Air Service, do during World War I? Were they effective? And if they were, why was it decided to merge it with the Royal Flying Corps, or RFC, to form the RAF, or Royal Air Force? The Royal Naval Air Service did, well, pretty much a bit of everything, really. Officially, it was supposed to be a part of fleet reconnaissance to patrol the friendly coast looking for enemy ships and submarines, and obviously an offensive role attacking enemy ports and harbours and shipping. all of which they did. They also experimented with mounting aircraft directly onto ships. They, bizarrely enough, when they were on the Western Front, actually ended up basically inventing the armoured car as a means of security and offence. They also ended up manning airships, and because of the growth of the Royal Naval Air Service, also ended up manning quite a number of elite fighter squadrons on the Western Front. So they really were doing everything. Even brief forays into strategic bombing. By the end of the war, they actually had almost 3,000 aircraft and over 100 airships of various descriptions, albeit most of them were blimps. And so, yeah, they were actually a very effective bunch of people. To the point there was quite a bit of inter-service rivalry. They also scored a nice engineering coup in that they managed to get a near-exclusive contract with the Sopwith Company, who were one of the providers of some of the best aircraft that the Western Allies managed to produce in World War One. So they quite often got exclusive access, or early access, I should say, to things like the Sopwith 1.5 Strutter, the triplane, and the Camel, when those aircraft were coming out and replacing older and more obsolete aircraft. As for why it was decided to merge it with the RFC to form the RAF, that was as the result of what was called the Smuts report by Jan Smuts, or Smuts, as the name suggests, South African army officer in the end of World War One, and this was basically for two reasons. One was that there was an awful lot of duplication of work going on because the RNAS was basically the Navy's Air Force and the RFC was basically the Army's Air Force. And it was, in some ways, it was actually relatively far-sighted. It recognised the potential of strategic bombing, the need for unified home defence, and the need to not duplicate effort as much as had been happening before. And that combined with the realization that the needs of an air force of any description are obviously going to be somewhat different from the needs of an army or a navy. He wanted to see an air service where the airmen themselves had the first priority and first call over how they got their aircraft, resources, etc., i.e. an equal service to the two older arms of the military. And well, the RFC and the RNAS were the two competing air forces at the time, so it merged them together, and theoretically you should get the Royal Air Force, which would then do everything that was necessary of it, in theory, efficiently. Obviously, that had something of a negative knock-on effect for the Royal Navy because they took something of a backseat to the Royal Air Force's more land-based concerns. But that wasn't necessarily something that everybody could foresee at the time. And finally, for this week, Matt Blom asks, had the Spanish gone with the Jeune École approach versus building the España-class dreadnoughts, how might that have affected actions in the Spanish Civil War? Would such smaller ships have been better suited for the conflict? So, if they'd gone with that approach and gone with a sort of a mostly cruiser and destroyer-based approach, the destroyers probably wouldn't have been that much use in the Spanish Civil War because with so many aircraft lying around and the limited capacity of destroyers to provide shore bombardment support, which realistically speaking was mostly what they were good for, I think a lot of them would have fallen victim to various forms of attack fairly quickly. If instead of the Españas they'd built, or what they built at the time, a series of light cruisers, maybe a few armoured cruisers perhaps, they would have had a few more ships around, and certainly ships armed with 6, 7, 8-inch guns would have been a lot more suited for shore bombardment, and, well, more hulls, better, they would have had better use out of them because there's just more of them that can cover more areas, and they're large enough to see off some of the more basic shore artillery and light aircraft attacks. So there is that as well. The main thing, to be perfectly honest, is the fact that with the Españas being built in the 1910s, by the time the Spanish Civil War starts, anything that's built at that point is going to be pretty much obsolete. About the only other thing that could change is that with more more ships available and fewer of them, well, and them not just being them not being as heavily armed, the fact that both sides ended up with a battleship kind of, in a way, stalemated some of the naval activity that could have gone on. Whereas if you had more ships but individually less powerful, then it could have just been a simple majority of ships going to one side or the other that could have given them a naval advantage. Not that the various powers backing both sides would have let that stand for too long, I imagine, but the main problem with the Jeune École approach is likely to be just the fact it's designed around harassing enemy merchant shipping. And there were a lot of very heavily armed neutrality patrols around Spain during the Civil War to make sure that the Spanish Civil War didn't disrupt merchant shipping. Um, I mean, an internal civil war in somewhere like Spain, the Navy's always going to play second fiddle to land and air forces. So, yeah, as I say, apart from maybe giving one side or the other a slightly more decisive edge in shore bombardment capability, I don't think it would have made too much of a difference. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video. Just remember, back at the beginning, the channel admin, just in case you skipped over it, has a couple of competition announcements, both the new giveaway and the winner of the previous giveaway, and a few other details. Thank you very much, and see you again.